Hello, this is Kevin from Star Wars Middle Ground, and today I'm here to review Star Wars from a certain point of view. Now, if you've been listening to Middle Ground, a Star Wars podcast since the beginning, you'll know that I chose the last short story in this book as the worst piece of new Star Wars canon, and I still stand by that. So you might be curious as to why this is the first official book review I'm doing if I considered this book to be the absolute worst. And there's a few reasons for that. One, I'm trying to be more open-minded, and I hadn't actually read the entire book. I had read the first couple stories, and then I read the last one because I thought it would be interesting to see a story centered around the Wills. And I thought that story was absolute garbage. So I decided to just put the book down and not touch it again. But I was looking for a Star Wars audiobook to listen to, and I saw it was on Audible, and it was by a whole bunch of famous Star Wars narrators. Jonathan Davis and Mark Thompson are two that first come to mind. That as I started to read more of the short story books, I realized that I should give, from a certain point of view, another chance if I'm going to give a book like Canto Bight or Clone Wars Stories of Light and Dark a chance to. And interestingly enough, they do share some of the same authors. So the gimmick with this book is that this was released in 2017 in conjunction with the 40-year anniversary of the original Star Wars movie. So they took that number 40 and gave 40 different stories to 40 different authors. And what that means is that there's 40 degrees of varying quality here. The book is set up basically as the plot of A New Hope. So you're going through the entirety of the movie, but from a different point of view of different background characters. In this book, you never get the perspective of, like, let's say Han when he's doing the Death Star attack. You're more or less going to get random X-Wing pilot or Tusken Raider during when R2-D2 is being sold by the Jawas. That is the kind of style that this book is going for. And in some ways it works because you get really interesting point of views, but in some of the other ones, as I will point out, it really doesn't work. This book is both a great book and a bad book at the same time. Now, in terms of the actual quality of the stories, the written word, you can look at the author's name on the front of the book and look at their previous Star Wars work or future Star Wars work and tell if the story is going to be good or if you personally like it. So, for instance, Claudia Gray has a great story in here called Master and Apprentice about Qui-Gon Jinn talking to Obi-Wan right before he goes on his adventure with Luke. And Claudia Gray is a great character writer. So you know that this story is going to be good no matter how long or short it's going to be. Another example is Chuck Wendig. If you didn't like the Aftermath trilogy, you probably aren't going to like his story about the bartender in the cantina. Now, that being said, I do feel that the biggest problem with this book, aside from the quality of the stories, is the fact that there are 40 stories shoved into this book. I feel that maybe if you cut them down in half, maybe make it 20, it would help the pacing. Because this book really feels crammed for the gimmick. It really feels like there's 40 stories stuffed in there. Now, not initially, because at first you get the perspective of Ramus Antilles, then you go to a stormtrooper, and then you go to one of the people filing paperwork because they didn't shoot down the escape pod. And it seems to go chronologically with A New Hope, obviously. And the pacing's pretty good. Then you get the Jawa. Until you get to the Cantina stories. And it's a group of stories that obviously take place in and around the Cantina. But when you read the first story, it ends with Greedo's death, I believe. I believe it's from his perspective, too. So when that story ends, you presumably would think we're going to go to the Millennium Falcon or maybe the Stormtroopers outside and when they're shooting at the Millennium Falcon and then go from there. But the next story starts off before the Cantina again, and they see Greedo walking in. And then after that story ends, you get the perspective of the Cantina band players and their adventure from before and after and during, and then you get the bartender, and it just ruins the pacing when you know the movie, obviously. So you go from ending one scene, you know what the next scene is, but instead you're being pulled back to rewatch the scene again and again and again. and it really does not work. The best of these stories, in my opinion, is the one with the Cantina band players, because it was actually kind of interesting to learn that they worked for Jabba beforehand and how important this performance is. Neat little stuff like that. And I would say that that is a positive of the book, just learning about the different points of view from all these characters, because that is a really cool thing about Star Wars, is that, as everyone says, every character has a fleshed out backstory. So it is kind of neat to get it from all these different patrons and stuff and the stormtroopers. But when it feels like you can just cut most of this out, it really does affect the pacing of the book. And again, you could skip through them, which is what I would recommend doing. I don't know if I would recommend the entire book, but I will recommend some of the stories that you could either listen to on Audible, or I'm sure there's a YouTube video describing what happens. You could go on Wikipedia and read it. I wouldn't recommend reading the whole thing. So I don't want to be entirely negative here because, like I said, this book is bad, but this book is also great. So I would just like to give a few of the best stories here before I get into some of the worst stories. One of the best stories to me was Ramus, like I had mentioned earlier. It's a really good bridge between Rogue One and A New Hope, even though Rogue One really was a bridge to A New Hope from the prequel trilogy. But this is basically from the time the Tantive 4 leaves Scarif to Ramus Antilli's death at the beginning. And like I said earlier, with giving all these characters more depth, nuance, and background, it's really interesting to learn about the captain. He's writing a letter to his wife and daughter. I don't believe he actually gets to send it, but it's cool that the very first story establishes the theme of hope, which is obviously big in A New Hope. And going forward, it's kind of neat to see how hope trickles in through all these stories. A lot of characters at the end decide to give way to hope and live their lives the way they want to, rather than what people are telling them or how their life is going compared to what they want to do. Next one is Master and Apprentice. What I liked about this was that it gave more context for the Force Ghosts, how they're able to see past, present, and future. I think this is the first time in the new canon, or at least back then it was in 2017, that we actually got some solid information on Force Ghosts that wasn't the Yoda arc in Season 6 of the Clone Wars or the movies. But it's interesting to learn that Qui-Gon can actually physically manifest. Before, it was just established that he was a voice because he didn't complete his training. I don't believe this explained how he could do that. I'm just assuming he just trained enough. I'm not entirely sure. But it was also neat to see their relationship all these years later, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, and how he still sees him as the young Padawan that he always knew. The next one is Time of Death. This is from Obi-Wan's perspective. It's really interesting to see what he's going through as he's dying. He's basically, without giving too much away, he's being pulled into the past, present, and future, and he's able to actually, they reference it, he's able to see like the Empire fall and then the First Order rise, which is really cool. And he's sort of stuck in the moment where Vader kills him until he is able to let go and realize that Luke can go on without him. Then I have Eclipse, which is about Breha and Bail Organa's last moments on Alderaan. It's just nice to see them again. I really liked the Leia Princess of Alderaan book, pretty much just for the relationship between Bail and Leia and Breha and Leia. But this is interesting to actually see Breha and Bail, or Breha, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Breha and Bail's last moments together, and just see their relationship, because you don't really get that in anything else. Last one was a fun one. It's called Added Muscle. I would recommend listening to the audiobook version of this because it's from Boba Fett's perspective, but it's voiced by John Hamm, who is from Mad Men, if you have ever seen that show. He's the main character, Don Draper. It was just nice to see Boba Fett. It was interesting to actually get in Boba Fett's head, hear what he's thinking during the whole time. He thinks he's like a hot shot and all that. It was just a fun little read for one of the most famous Star Wars characters. All right, now we're going to get into the bad. I only have two, because a lot of this book is either just bizarre, great, or bad. There really is no in between with those. So we have Of MSE 6 and Men, obviously a play on the title of Mice and Men. And it's just very poorly written. It's very technical. It's from the perspective of a mouse droid. And it's just the worst, if I'm being honest. It's horrible. The audiobook really suffers from this too. Not even, I believe it was Mark Thompson's narration could save this, and he's usually great. The story is basically this mouse droid being sent around by TK-421. Obviously, we know who he is. And he's sending it around, and then it's implied to be Tarkin, sees a hologram of him on the mouse droid and becomes infatuated with him, and then starts secretly sending the mouse droid back and forth, and then he tries to have an affair with TK-421. I'm going to be honest, I skipped the ending, just because it was so boring and it felt so irrelevant to everything that's going on and didn't feel like it added anything to the new canon. You know, even with the bizarre ones, I believe it was called Baptism or Baptist. It was about the creature, the Dianoga, in the trash compactor. That one was bizarre, but I would still say it at least adds some interesting tidbits and information to the new canon, even though the story itself is not super interesting. But with this, I just don't like seeing Tarkin getting down with a subordinate. It seems a little bit below him to be able to do that. And he also never seemed like he was romantically interested in anybody either. I just thought it was a weird take to make it Tarkin, of all people, especially during A New Hope. You figured his focus would be more on Princess Leia, Alderaan, making sure the Death Star works, how to take down the rebellion, instead of having, an affair with a subordinate. Lastly, we have the Wills. Now, this is the story that made me put the book down, and I did listen to this one all the way through just to make sure it was as bad as I remembered. And it was. It is very cringeworthy. I don't use that term often, but that's the best way to describe this. It's essentially just one big joke. It centers around two Wills. One is writing the opening crawl for A New Hope, and then the other one is criticizing everything he says, down to, why are you starting with episode 4? Well, I figured it'd be the most interesting place to start. Well, what about Darth Maul and Ahsoka and the Clone Wars? Oh, well, maybe I'll go back and write them someday. All right, it's a period of civil war. A period of civil war? That's basically the entire story. The audiobook was complete with a record scratch, too, which really made me roll my eyes. It just tries too hard to be meta, is basically what I'm trying to say. And it's strange because the author Tom Ankelberger wrote a story for Clone Wars Light and Dark. I believe he did an adaptation of the very first episode, Ambush. And that one was from Yoda's perspective. And that was really good. So when I found out he wrote this, and he wrote the Wills story in the sequel to this book, from a certain point of view, The Empire Strikes Back. So I was very surprised because this one was so poorly written. I was, again, very surprised to just find out that he had written that story too. So it's not that he's a bad author by any means. I just think that they took this concept that could have been interesting and sort of just flipped it on its head and decided not to do anything with it. So I would not recommend reading the entire book, mainly just the stories I picked out or if some of the descriptions of the other ones entice you. While there are some solid hits in here, and they actually do not only enhance the canon and the lore, but A New Hope as well, there are Of Mice and Men and Wills. So that's going to do it for me here on Star Wars Middle Ground. I'm Kevin, and I'll see you in the next one. Farewell.